By the spring of 1887, a rancher named Bob Cator had lost most of his herd to a single Panhandle winter, and so had every other outfit in his county. 75 out of every 100 cattle gone. Not to rustlers, not to a stampede, to a single winter. The temperature hit 30 below in November, then 43 below the month after, and when the snow cleared, cowhands found carcasses stacked against the drift fences for 35 miles, frozen where the herds had piled up trying to outrun the wind. Some outfits skinned 250 dead animals in a single mile, because a hide was still worth something even when the cow underneath it was not. That winter is called the Big Die-Up, and it did not care whose name was on the brand. Bob Cator had ridden that stretch of the Panhandle since 1878, out of the same dugout as his brother James. By that spring, he had seen enough. He sold out, and he and his wife left for Oregon and never ran cattle again. But here is the twist, friend. His brother James stayed on that same ground. He was still ranching it 40 years later. He founded his county's first bank in 1907 and died in the same rock house in 1927. Same brothers, same blizzard, same herd, cut in half by the same winter, and 50 years later, only one of their names was still on that land. The Cators were not the only ones that winter, friend. Across the Panhandle, the ranchers who came out the other side of it standing were almost never the ones with the biggest herd, or the fastest horse, or the sharpest rope. They were the ones who had put up hay in July for a January they could not see coming yet. The ones who had already built a windbreak nobody had needed for 3 mild winters running. The ones who kept a book. Tonight, I am not handing you 25 rules of a trail drive. That trail ends. I am handing you 50 years, friend, the ones that come after the last cattle drive a man ever rides, when the real work of making something last is only just getting started. Wisdom number 1. Why the driest year of a rancher's life almost never announces itself with a drought. Wisdom number 7. Why a fence built to keep a neighbor's cattle out started a year of gunfire in this state. And it was never really about the fence. And the last one, the one my own great-granddaddy's book closes on, about a piece of ground that only ever had to be won once and had to be kept for the rest of a man's life. That is what 50 years of ranching actually teaches a man, and it is rarely the lesson Hollywood put in front of you. Not for me, friend, because the real West that came after the trail dust settled is buried even deeper than the trail itself. Nobody made a movie about a man storing hay. Nobody made a movie about a fence line. This channel exists to dig that part back up, one true story at a time. So tap that subscribe button before we ride on, and let's get into it. My name is Gus Merritt, and my people have run cattle in the Texas Hill Country for 4 generations now. On the desk in front of me sits my great-granddaddy's tally book, the one that started as a count of longhorns on a trail to Kansas. But most of that book, friend, the thick middle of it, was never written on a trail at all. It was written sitting right here, on land he bought and fenced and nearly lost twice in the 50 years between the day he came home off his last drive and the day he handed that book to his son. Tonight's video is me finally doing justice to that middle part, the part where the real cost of every lesson in here got paid. Rivers don't care how many trails you've run, I told you last time. Well, neither does a Panhandle winter, friend. And neither does a dry summer, and neither does a neighbor with a wire cutter. The rules just keep coming. A man only gets to decide whether he already knows them. Wisdom 1. The driest year of a rancher's life rarely starts with a drought. It starts the summer before, the good one, the one where the grass came up thick, and every man on the range decided the range could hold just a few more head. The summer of 1886 across the Texas Panhandle was hot. Brush fires burning off what grass there was, water holes drying to cracked mud early, and still the herds kept growing because nobody had a rule that said stop. No fence told a man how much grass was actually his to use. No book told him how much of it a cow needed to survive a real winter, not just an easy one. When November came in hard, the range had nothing left in reserve, and neither did the cattle standing on it. Wisdom 2. A cow will always drift with the wind, and a rancher who does not know that will lose his whole herd looking for it in the wrong direction. In blizzard country, cattle do not fight a north wind. They turn their backs to it and walk, for days, if the storm does not let up, straight into whatever fence, canyon, or frozen creek is waiting downwind. The outfits that built drift fences running east to west caught a herd before it walked itself to death. Outfits without one lost it outright. The Panhandle Stock Association strung one such fence in 1882, cutting clear across 4 counties, 4 years before anybody knew exactly why they would need it that badly. Wisdom 3. Hay put up in July is a promise to a cow you have not met yet. The one standing in your corral in January wondering if you kept your word. A rancher who cut and stacked hay in the fat months when the work felt pointless and the grass looked like it would never stop coming is the same rancher who had something left to feed a starving animal in the lean ones. It cost him a week of back-breaking labor he did not seem to need at the time. It bought him a herd that was still alive to sell in the spring, while a neighbor's carcasses lined the fence a half-mile down the same creek. That is rule of the tally book number 3, friend, and my great-granddaddy wrote it in his own hand after that winter, in words plainer than anything I could put in front of you. The hay you didn't put up in July is the cow you bury in January. Wisdom 4. A written count of your own stock is the only early warning a rancher has. The ranches that survived 1886 and 1887 in any shape at all were, almost without exception, the ones that already knew roughly how many cattle they were carrying on how many acres, because somebody had written the numbers down instead of guessing. A guess cannot tell a man he is overstocked. The range tells him instead, and by then it is telling everyone at once in the worst possible month. A book can tell him in June, when there is still time to sell down the herd instead of watching the winter sell it down for him. Pattern break, friend. Notice what the first 4 have in common. Not one of them is about roping, riding, or shooting straight. Every single one of them is about what a man does in a season when nothing bad seems to be happening yet. That is the whole secret, buried in 50 years of this business, and it never once made it into a single Western. Wisdom 5. A written record settles more arguments than a drawn gun ever could. When cattle drifted in a storm and mixed with other outfits' herds, the count in a man's own book, kept honestly before the wind blew, was worth more at roundup than any amount of shouting about whose cow was whose. Charles Goodnight, who built one of the largest ranches in the Panhandle out of 1,600 head of cattle and a canyon nobody else wanted, put it plainly: cowards never lasted long enough to become real cowboys, and neither in his outfit did a man whose word could not be trusted at a roundup fire. Wisdom 6. Land you do not fence is land you do not actually own, no matter what a deed says. For years after the trail drive slowed down, a rancher's grass belonged to him mostly on paper, and to whoever's cattle got there first in practice. That worked until newcomers started running stock on range a big outfit had used for free for a decade. A wire fence was the only thing that turned a claim into a fact a cow could not argue with. Wisdom 7. Cutting another man's fence never once put grass back on the range. It only put a man in front of a jury or a coffin. In the early 1880s, gangs of riders moved across Texas at night with wire cutters, tearing down fences that blocked trails to water, cut off public land, or fenced ground. The cutters did not believe anyone had a right to close off. It was never really about the wire. It was about who got to decide whose grass was whose. And for one bloody year, men on both sides of that argument were shot over it. until the legislature finally made fence cutting a felony and made building a fence across a public road one too. Wisdom 8. The day a man strings his first strand of wire, he is telling every neighbor within 20 miles exactly where his promise ends and starts. Joseph Glidden's twisted barbed wire, patented in November of 1874, spread across this state faster than almost anything before or since, because it did something no amount of shouting or shooting ever managed. It let a man defend a boundary without standing on it himself, day and night, for life. Wisdom 9. A ranch that survives one bad decade and a ranch that survives 5 are not run by the same kind of thinking. The first only needs luck and a strong back. The second needs a man willing to sell cattle he loves the look of when the range cannot hold them, instead of waiting to see if it agrees with him. My great-granddaddy sold off nearly a third of his herd in the dry summer of 1893, at a price that made him sick to write down in this book. He wrote one line under the number. It still beats losing them for nothing at all come January. Wisdom 10. The men worth trusting on open range were rarely the loudest ones at the roundup fire. Goodnight ran his outfit on a simple standard: no whiskey, no gambling, no man who had already been fired somewhere else for stealing or drink. The men who stayed under a rule like that for years were some of the steadiest and most honorable he ever rode beside. A rancher does not build 50 years on hired hands he has to watch. He builds it on the handful he never has to. Keep counting, friend, because we are only at the halfway mark of what 50 years actually asks of a man. And the second half is where most outfits that made it through a bad winter still manage to lose everything anyway. Wisdom 11. Owning the land under a windmill is worth more in a dry year than owning 3 times the cattle standing on it. Water rights and windmill sites, more than grass itself, decided which outfits survived the driest stretches after the open range closed. A man with a working well on his own deeded ground could weather a summer that broke a neighbor still trying to water stock off a shrinking creek that 6 other outfits also claimed. Wisdom 12. Debt taken on in a good year comes due in a bad one. On a calendar it does not consult you about. Ranchers borrowed heavily in the flush years of the early 1880s, when beef prices looked like they could only climb. The bus came right behind the big die-up. Cattle prices collapsed, just as their herds were smallest and their notes were due in full, and the land they had bought on credit went to auction. Wisdom 13. The movies show you standing on a ridge by yourself. A ranch is a wife keeping books at a kitchen table while the market falls, and children old enough to ride fence line before they are old enough to shave, and neighbors who show up to help brand or bury without waiting to be asked twice. The outfits that made it 50 years hardly ever made it on one man's back. They made it on a family's. Wisdom 14. What a man teaches his son on a horse matters less over 50 years than what he teaches him about a book. Roping and riding can be picked up by any able-bodied hand for wages. Counting honestly, saving when it feels foolish, and writing down a hard year instead of pretending it did not happen, that only gets passed on purpose, at a kitchen table, with the book open between them. Wisdom 15. The driest years and the hardest winters do not arrive on any predictable schedule, and a rancher who plans as if they will not come again is planning to lose everything a second time. Texas ranchers who rebuilt after 1887 rebuilt smaller herds on bigger, fenced acreage, with hay stored every single year because the men who survived once had already learned that a mild decade is not a promise, it is only a pause. Pattern break again, friend. 15 wisdoms in, and I have not told you a single story about a gunfight because there were almost none in the 50 years I am describing to you. That is not an accident of what I chose to tell you. That is what the actual record looks like once you take Hollywood's hand off the scale. Wisdom 16. A neighbor's word, given at a roundup and never written down, held up in this country for decades, until cattle stopped being worth enough for anyone to risk their word on. When beef prices were strong, a handshake settled a boundary dispute or a mixed herd count faster than any court could. When prices collapsed, those same handshakes started ending up in front of judges, because desperate men remembered agreements differently than they had made them. Wisdom 17. The Homestead Act gave a man free land. It never once promised him water on it, and thousands of homesteaders who settled the plains behind the ranchers found that out in their first dry summer. Big outfits had already secured the water, often years before newcomers arrived. That imbalance, more than the land itself, was at the root of most of the fence-cutting fights that followed. Wisdom 18. A drift fence built to save cattle from a blizzard, and a boundary fence built to keep a neighbor's stock off your grass look identical from horseback. They come from two different fears, one of weather and one of other men, and a rancher who cannot tell them apart ends up building the wrong one at the worst time. Wisdom 19. The cattle that survive a bad winter are rarely the strongest going into it. They are the ones with the most reserve of fat before the storm starts. Which means the real decision that saves a herd is made months before the first snowflake falls. A rancher who waits for hard weather to start making hard decisions has already lost the argument with the calendar. Wisdom 20. Debt on land is not the same as debt on cattle, and a rancher who cannot tell the difference in a bad year will sell the wrong thing to survive it. A rancher can rebuild a herd in 5 years with patience and a decent bull. Land auctioned off from under a family that has already fenced it, watered it, and buried people on it rarely comes back into that same family's hands again. By 1893, my own great-granddaddy had buried a brother, sold a third of his herd at a price he hated, and rebuilt a fence line the county courts had made him take down twice during the cutting wars, before putting it back up a third time, legally, on his own deeded ground. He wrote one line in the book that year, in a hand steadier than the one that opened this whole story on a trail in 1866, about not getting to choose which 50 years a man is handed, only how he spends the ones he gets. Sit with that a second, friend, because it is the entire difference between the 50 years I am handing you tonight and the version of this country Hollywood built. The movie version ends the moment the last cattle drive does, one lone rider fading toward a sunset, credits rolling before anyone has to watch him do the actual work of staying put. Wisdom 21. The rancher who wins a fight over land does not win it with a gun. He wins it in front of a judge, with a deed and a survey and a receipt that proves he paid for what he is standing on. The law that finally ended the fence-cutting wars stopped more bloodshed in this state than every gunfighter combined ever did. Wisdom 22. Grief on a working ranch gets exactly the amount of time the herd allows it, and not one day more. A man buries a brother, a wife, or a child, and the cattle still need water the next morning, whether he feels able to or not. That is the only reason, friend, there was still a ranch left standing for the next generation to inherit at all. Circle that year, friend, 1893. It is the year the drought, the debt, and the last of the open-range gunfire over fence lines all came due on the same ranchers at the same time. And it is the year that separated the outfits that would still be standing 50 years later from the ones whose names now only survive on a courthouse auction record. Wisdom 23. A ranch a man can hand to his son is worth more than a ranch a man merely dies owning. And the difference between the two is rarely decided by how much land he had. It is decided by whether the son actually knows how to run it before the father is gone. The outfits that lasted past one generation were nearly always the ones where a boy was doing the books years before he ever inherited a single acre of it. Wisdom 24. Every hard-won piece of ground in this country only ever gets won once, After that, the job every year after is keeping it, and keeping is duller, slower, far less photographed work than winning ever was. Which is why Hollywood skipped it and went looking for another gunfight instead. And Wisdom 25, the last one, the one my great-granddaddy's book actually ends on, written in 1898, 32 years after that river took Mr. Carr on a trail out of Texas. He does not write about the drive at all in that final entry, friend. He writes about a fence post he set with his own hands that spring on ground he had now held, fenced, buried people on, and fed through 2 winters that should have broken him. He writes that a man only ever gets to win his ground once. Everything after that first fence post is just keeping his word to it. One dry summer and one hard winter at a time, for as long as he is able to stand. They are not rules written on a wall in some company office, friend, the way the trail code ended up in 1885. They are not even really rules at all. They are what is left over after 50 years of a man paying in fence posts and buried cattle and a wife's kitchen table arithmetic for every single piece of wisdom I have handed you tonight. Paper never earned a single one of them. A man standing in a field, deciding to do the unglamorous thing one more summer in a row, earned every last one. 25 wisdoms, friend, and every single one of them was bought, not taught. My great-granddaddy never once wrote in that book that the old way was finished. Not after the die-up, not after the cutting wars, not after he buried people he loved on the very ground he had nearly lost twice. He kept it, and then he kept it again for 50 years, and then he handed a book full of that keeping to a son who had already learned to read it. We go back to that Panhandle winter one more time, friend, because it is where tonight started. And it is where every single wisdom I gave you actually gets tested. James and Bob Cator rode into that same blizzard side by side. 50 years later, only one of their names was still on that land, still on a bank charter, still in a rock house their grandchildren could point to. The rest of what separated them, friend, is the 25 wisdoms I just handed you. So here is what I want to know, friend. Which one of these 25 would your own family have needed most, the summer before their hardest winter? Tell me below, and tell me the story if you have one, because the story with the most replies is the one I go looking for next. Next time, we are finally going back for that barrel of water sitting in the corner of a Dodge City saloon, friend. And the year is 1857, the year a state legislature quietly admitted that what was in a man's glass had already killed more of him than any outlaw ever managed. Ride careful, friend. The trail remembers, and so does the ground you finally stopped to fence.